So today we're taking a deep dive into divorce and solving the big issues. Welcome back again, Geoff. Good to see you. Firstly, in your opinion, what are some of the barriers that hold people back from getting a divorce?
Well, there's probably a couple that we see. The first and a major one is, of course, they're missing some important document. For example, their marriage certificate, because that's necessary to even file for the divorce. So, trying to track down the right documents is one thing that holds people back. There's a couple of others. People sometimes are concerned in high conflict situations that their safety might be at risk if they apply for a divorce, or their confidentiality, such as their address or the address of their children school, might be revealed by filing for divorce. We can overcome those things by not disclosing those during a divorce application. Other things include the expense. The divorce is actually more expensive than getting married, or even filing for a property settlement with the court. So the barrier to entry, so to speak, can be a bit high if you don't have a concession card, for example. The cost of filing for a divorce in Australia at the moment is about $1,060 or $350 if you do have a concession. So expense is a problem. Probably the last one I can mention would be bit about human nature and procrastination. So, if you've got a lot of things on in your life and you don't have to get divorced tomorrow, a lot of people will kick it down the road, so to speak. So, procrastinating about finalising your marriage is probably the fourth thing that I would mention.
So, putting obstacles aside, can you step us through the basic process of a divorce?
Sure. So, unlike a property settlement where you can, as soon as you've separated, agree to divide your assets or sort out your affairs of your children any time after separation, divorce is a legal process, and one of the fundamentals of that is that you've got to be separated for 12 months. Now, where that gets tricky is that we quite often have parties who either A, live under the same roof for a period after separation, or B, even reconcile for brief periods or periods of time after separation. So the legislation that deals with divorce helps us overcome those queries about living under the same roof or reconciliation periods by potentially extending the period of 12 months by how long you got back together. Or if living under the same roof, if you produce sufficient evidence by way of affidavit, which is a formal sworn document, that you live separately, that you separated your finances, for example, ended your personal relationship, those sort of things, you can actually then proceed with an application. Now, the only other thing then with the starting a divorce application is, well, what type of application do you want to bring? Now, there's two ways to do it. There's a joint application, which is where you and your former spouse both agree to file the paperwork together and sign it initially. That's a simpler process. And there's an individual application. So either, for example, the former husband or wife, one or other elects to actually file for the divorce. Strangely enough, probably 75 to 80% of the applications that we do are individual applications rather than joint, which tends to reflect that there can be a degree of lack of cooperation between the parties getting the divorce done, or someone simply doesn't want to contribute towards the cost.
Sure. So it sounds like a bit of a process. So during that process of completing a divorce, what are some of the hardest parts that you and your staff seem to deal with?
I think the most tricky bit, if I could call it that way, is proving service of a divorce application when it's an individual application. Because obviously, if you've got a joint application, both of you have signed it, you don't have to prove to the court that either of you are aware of that application. But as a fundamental, you've got to make sure that the court is happy that both parties at least know the divorce application is on foot. And we do run into some barriers in relation to proving that service to the standard the court requires. I might just do a little bit of a jump back in history. So the Family Law Act that regulates divorces has been around since 1975, and it provided that divorces could be served either by post or in person. In other words, someone handing the other spouse the divorce documents. It didn't provide, for example, for service by email because email didn't exist, and it's never been upgraded ever since. So if you have an uncooperative spouse, and you post them the documents and they don't sign anything to say they've got it, then we can't show service has occurred, and we have to look at alternatives as to what occurs from there. So service is by far the most complex process we have to overcome when we file for a divorce.
It does certainly sound like service can get tricky. So what workarounds can you use to get around that?
Well, there's quite a few. So the court, in its wisdom, has said that you can satisfy the court in other ways, provided you give evidence as to why that will work. For example, you can advise the court by producing it various paperwork that if service by post won't work, or you can't serve them in person because of either the expense, because of where they live, or you simply don't know where they are in a physical location sense, that you can serve in other ways, and such as email is sometimes allowed. I've seen where we're able to get an order to be able to serve by text or SMS. We've even been able to serve by social media, so that if we know someone has a Facebook account, then we may be able to serve the paperwork via a messenger service such as that.
So it sounds like that there is a few alternatives, but does it ever get to the point where it's too tricky and the issues are too big to actually achieve the finalisation of a divorce?
My answer to that is no. If you're persistent enough, we will find a way. And again, if we can't serve under the rules and we can't find a person via email or text or otherwise to serve them, then the court allows us to proceed in another way, and that's by what we call either substituted service or even dispensing with service. Now, without getting too technical, substituted service is where the documents are given to a third party. For example, let's say it's the wife who makes an application for divorce. We may arrange to give the documents to an adult child who still we know has interactions with the father, and that the court would be satisfied that the child will give the dad the paperwork. That's called substituted service. The last one that we see in a few instances every year is what we call dispensing with service. So this usually happens when the parties have been separated for a while. So you might have been separated for 10 years and completely lost contact with your former spouse. They might have moved interstate, they don't have any children, there's no relatives that you can contact. And if you can produce sufficient evidence to say that despite all reasonable inquiries, you don't know where they are, then the court will still actually proceed and grant a divorce if you've exhausted every possible inquiry you reasonably can.
Right, so when you first receive a divorce application, what are the most common areas that really need sorting out in the early stages of preparing the divorce paperwork?
Well, there's two that come up. What the most regular one that I can say is probably is an issue now of living under the same roof after separation.
So how does that work? So
Well,
you can still be technically separated but live together.
absolutely. So it's quite common now. We talk about the cost of living crisis and modern phrases like that, but the reality is that there is quite a percentage of parties who, due to economic circumstances, when they've separated, i.e. believe they've ended their marriage, still have to live under the one roof. So if we can demonstrate to the court that you have done that, and there are a number of what I would call ticker box things you have to work through to show that you are living separately, then you can satisfy the court that you are living separately but under the one roof. I'll give you a couple of examples. For example, has the intimate relationship come to an end? Are you living in separate rooms? Are you no longer cooking meals together? Do you separately spend time with the children? Do you separately spend time with friends or not socialise together anymore? What have you done with the finances? Who pays for things? If you can show the court that those things show that you are living separately and apart, then the court will usually be satisfied. The hardest bit we sometimes find is the court will require us to not only have, say, the wife in her application swear that that's the case, but they do require some support from a third party. So, i.e. a family friend or a relative or somebody who knows that they've separated. So they have to then swear a document called an affidavit that says, look, on the 23rd of January, Mrs. Brown told me, my friend, that she's separated from Mr. Brown. And I noticed then that they started socialising separately, or that when I went to their house that there appeared to be two separate bedrooms set up. And the court is not overly onerous with the third-party affidavit, as we call it, but they do require some definite information from a third person. And that can sometimes be a bit of an impediment to getting a divorce underway.
Interesting. So Do you have anything else to say on that? Because that is interesting that people can still live under the same roof in the same house, but be separated. That can count towards their 12 months.
That's
So
correct. So
advice would be, I guess, to make sure that they make other people aware that is happening, and document that date down. So when it does come to divorce, that it's easier to complete, I guess.
it is. Keeping good records is important. For example, when did you advise a party such as Centrelink of separation? Do you have evidence that you wrote an email to them and said, well, I've separated from Mr. Brown, as I mentioned before, on the 23rd of January? That's good evidence that you can attach that to show that, yes, at that stage you had definitely made the decision to separate.
So we always tend to finish these chats away. We get into the heavy topics such as divorce and separation and property and superannuation, settlement and splitting. You always like to give a bit of advice on wellness and how people can best deal with going through a tough situation. So do you have any go-to sayings or statements that people may be able to read, or that you might be able to share to the listeners today, that they could sort of take away and it can help them deal with going through a tough situation?
Yeah, I do. I think one of my favourite sayings is, you are the average of the four people you are closest to. Now, what does that mean? Well, it tends to mean, in my view, that whether it's your family members, it's friends, it's your own children, for example, that your behaviours are shaped by the people you associate with. Now, in the context of a separation, for example, if you are then associating or hanging around with your closest associates are people who are speaking negatively about your spouse all the time, doing those sort of things, you tend to then fall into that sort of behaviour yourself. On the alternative, if your associates are people who like to exercise, have positive attitudes, do all those sort of things, that tends to be how you will end up as well. So I'm lucky enough, apart from when I'm working in the divorce space, to work with youth, and I always tell them about this because it's important for them to say, well, look, if you want to improve in a certain part of your life, hang around with people who are better than you in that area, because they'll drag you up. So the same thing applies whether you're 15 years old or you're 55. I think that the people you associate with, if you actually go down and drill down who they are, you'll find that most of the actions you do are actually the average of the 4 or 5 that are closest to you.
So, Geoff, you spoke about one of the trickier issues is being separated while living under the same roof or in the same house. Are there any other tricky situations that you've come across that you've been able to solve?
Yeah, there is actually. The main one that we actually have is proving whether people are married. So, curiously, if you want to get divorced, you've actually got to show that you're married. And normally that's producing a marriage certificate, whether that's from within Australia or from overseas. However, there are a number of cultures in the world where there is no paperwork to show that you were married, even though it was clear in your mind that you were. For example, two examples I can think of were a couple who were married in a refugee camp on the Burmese border or Myanmar border. And there was no formal paperwork that occurred. It was simply that the head person of the refugee camp told them that they were married, and they were treated as they were married ever since. So we have to then produce, were there any photographs of that ceremony in inverted commas, or who else witnessed that occurring, so that we could actually prove the marriage occurred. We had a similar situation where in Central Africa a similar process occurred. So there was no formal marriage ceremony. What happens is the two families, the parents of the bride and groom, so to speak, meet together in a home, and they have a chat for 20 minutes, and they say they are now married. And that couple then moves into another, I won't say another hut, but another house within the village.
That's a cheaper way of getting out of paying for a wedding.
That is, it is very much so. So yes, so we have to, in those circumstances, we had to really dig in and talk to the relevant parties about what information we could show to the court to demonstrate that the marriage actually did validly occur, so that we could actually then do the divorce. So it might seem a lot of work, but it was necessary in those particular cases.
That wraps up our chat for today. Thanks again, Geoff, for sharing your insights and your advice and your stories. A very informative chat, and thanks again. We'll see you next time we sit down together.
Lovely. Look forward to it.